So I want to make the argument that a conflict is very likely. And so we'll be discussing why it's likely, how this war will manifest itself, and what will happen after this war. Okay? So the first thing to know about America is that it is a country that enjoys violence. Okay? You can say that Americans are addicted to violence. Okay, so for example, America has 434 guns. 434 million guns. That's 1.3 guns for every one person. And the guns they have, a lot of them are like semi-machine guns. Okay, so it's a very gun-obsessed society. Not only that, but they believe that gun ownership is their sacred right as Americans. So the Second Amendment of the Constitution is that every American has the right to bear arms. Then there's American football. Have you guys seen American football, where guys just bang at each other? Okay, it is extremely violent sport. In fact, America is really the only country that plays this sport, and Americans love football. The Super Bowl is the most watched TV event every year, and the game of football causes a lot of psychological injuries. Okay, so there are a lot of football players who at age 30, they either commit suicide or they will kill someone because their brains have been destroyed by the game. Okay, it is extremely violent sport, and even though it is barbaric, Americans love it. Americans also worship their history of wars. Okay, they believe that fighting wars, it's noble and it's sacred. Okay, so second thing to know about America is that it has a long history of fighting wars. In fact, you can make the argument that America has been continuously at war since its founding in 1776. Okay, even before that. So the first major war that America fought, of course, was the Revolution, right? 1776, War of Independence. And the reality is that Americans believed this war was sacred, and it was a revolution in human affairs. But if you actually look at the history of this war, you'll discover that the Americans didn't really fight this war for a good reason. They fought this war because the British were taxing them. But if you think about it, well, the British were providing defense. They were providing the army, right? So the British had a very good reason to tax the Americans. But the Americans didn't really like this, so they rebelled, okay? And the rebellion was actually the first American Civil War because there were actually a lot of Americans who wanted to remain in the Union. And so these loyalists, a lot of them were terrorized by extremists who wanted independence. Okay, so that is the American Revolution. But after the American Revolution, the Americans embarked on something called Manifest Destiny. And the idea of Manifest Destiny is that it is God's will that America controls all of the Americas, okay? North America and South America. So the Americans embarked on a violent colonization of all lands, okay? Killing many natives and other peoples to control America, okay? Manifest Destiny. And then this led to, from 1861 to 1865, the American Civil War, okay? Which killed 800,000, a million Americans, okay? But it was the deadliest war that America ever fought, okay? Much more so than World War II and World War I. In fact, more people died in this war than in World War I and World War II combined for America. Right? And we looked at the reason for the Civil War, again, you're like, they didn't actually have to fight this war, okay? So at the founding of the nation, America was divided into North and South. And the difference is that the North was very industrial, and the South was agricultural. Okay? And because the economies were different, the way they structured their politics and culture and society were different. So the North believed in free labor, meaning that you were free to do any job you want, and employers were free to hire anyone they wanted. And this system is obviously much more efficient because it's a much better use of manpower. And so this caused the North to prosper and become very, very wealthy and expanded, okay? So at the start of the Civil War in 1861, the North had a population of 22 million people. Okay, very wealthy, very powerful. The South was an agricultural-based economy, and therefore it had to rely on slave labor. All right. And even though slave labor made wealthy people very prosperous, it was not good for the economy as a whole. Okay, it was an inefficient use of manpower. And at the start of the war, they only had about 9 million people. Okay, but what's important to remember is that the North was an industrial-based economy. The South was an agricultural-based economy. So in terms of weapons manufacturing, in terms of logistics, in terms of organization, the North had a huge advantage over the South. Right? Now, why did they fight the war? And the standard explanation is because the North wanted to get rid of the evil of slavery. And that's not true. That's not what happened. So at the beginning of the founding of the nation, the Constitution permitted slavery. Okay, slavery was legal. And so the South were free to have as many slaves as they want. The North didn't need slaves because it was an industrial-based economy. The problem was the nation was expanding westwards, okay? The nation was expanding west. And they were adding more states into the Union. And the more states there are, they can send senators and representatives to Washington, D.C., okay? And the fear was that if these Western states were pro-slavery, then that would tip the balance in favor of the pro-slavery camp. But if the reverse were true, if the Western states were anti-slavery, then the South would be marginalized, okay? So for decades, there's this fierce debate as to how to handle these Western states as they were admitted into the Union one by one, okay? And the solution, what they call the Missouri Compromise, is that for every one state that came in as pro-slavery, the next state had to be anti-slavery, okay? Does that make sense? To maintain the balance. But the problem, of course, is that a lot of these Western states had their own opinions. So some of these Western states, for example, Kansas, would want to be anti-slavery, okay? So for decades, this was a huge issue politically in America, which divided the nation. The turning point was in 1860, when Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States. And Lincoln was radically anti-slavery. He believed that slavery was evil and had to be abolished at some point. Okay? The rest of the world abolished slavery. Why is it in America there are so many slaves? So that was Lincoln's agenda. But Lincoln was also a lawyer, and he believed that the South legally had a right to slavery. But over time, what we can do is limit slavery in the West. And therefore, over time, in maybe 100 years' time, slavery would naturally cease to exist. Okay? That was Lincoln's plan. Now, the South did not like this plan, and they were afraid of what Lincoln might really do as president, so they declared independence from the United States. They basically seceded from the Union, okay? And Lincoln, in response, invaded the South, okay? So basically, the Civil War was a battle over how much power the federal government had, okay? So from the perspective of the South, they were fighting the war for their right to freely express their political views, okay? And the North was fighting to maintain the Union. Slavery was not the main issue. In fact, Lincoln himself said that if I could end the war without freeing any slaves, I would do so. Slavery is not the main issue. Keeping the Union intact was the main issue. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. So, but again, they could have chosen to politically compromise. They could have had discussions, right? They could have even broke apart. But they chose to fight a gruesome civil war, okay? So the third thing you need to know about America is that America resolves conflicts through violence, okay? It doesn't really have a history of diplomacy. It has a history of war making, okay? That's how America usually resolves issues. So, given this history, now let's look at the conflicts in America today to see how serious the division is. And the reality is that today it's actually very, very serious. Far more so than in 1861 when they fought the first Civil War, okay? So let's look at the divisions. The first major division is basically between the haves and the have-nots, okay? So inequality and debt. So the wealthy, the top 1%, not only do they control most of the wealth in America, but they also control what we call the means of production, meaning that if new money comes into the system, they will seize it, okay? So basically, the top 1% have a monopoly over wealth production. And the way they make most of their money is actually through collecting debt, okay? By exploiting other people. And this is what we call a rentier economy. Okay? Now, what makes this situation even worse are the culture wars. So America is divided between left and right. And this division actually goes back to the very founding of America in the 1600s, okay? So in America, in its founding, there were two opposing visions or strands, okay? The first strand are people who came to America to build a kingdom of God, a Christian nation that follows the laws of God, okay? These are the Pilgrims and the Puritans, okay? And we've discussed them before. And they've always been there, okay? And they today comprise the right. And the right are people who believe in conservative Christian values, okay? The left. But there's also another strand of America, and these are dissidents or political dissidents. And they believe in the Enlightenment. They believe that reason should be the God of human affairs. Okay? And these were the founding fathers. Okay? The founding fathers believed in something called deism, which is that there is a God, but God gave us the power, reason, and logic to determine our own affairs. So the Constitution is a document based on deism, okay? Separation of church and state. And they want to create a multicultural, secular empire. Okay? And today it manifests itself in the left. Okay? Now, there's actually a lot of crossover between the left and the wealthy. Okay? Because if you look at the left, it's usually urban, liberal, and college educated. Okay, and coastal. Okay? And these are the people usually with all the money. Okay? So the inequality only makes the culture wars much worse. And so the right feel left out. Okay? Another major division in America that's important is the one between empire and democracy. Meaning that there are many people in America who benefit from America being an empire. But the rest suffer from the fact that America is an empire, okay? So, for example, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq made Wall Street very rich, right? But it was the poor, the right, who sent their sons to fight in these wars and who lost their lives or lost a limb, okay? It was the poor who were taxed in order to fund these wars. And it's the poor who must pay off the debt from these wars. Okay? So the right is also very isolationist, meaning like they don't want to fight these wars. They think that America should be an island. It should